Okay, so I think the previous slide was just about, I sort of touched on it, but the archetypal spaces for, like I said in Tantra, they can be subversive spaces. And in fact, Jung said as well that you engage, if you live in the material reality only, you're always incomplete, and that you really need to engage in the unconscious, and sometimes engaging in that means that you would be not conforming to the expectations and structures in the reality around you. And in a similar way, in the Indian tradition, many archetypes, and that image you had on the screen previously was of Kali. Many archetypes actually challenge convention and challenge quite profoundly and challenge things that are taboos or we consider to be taboos. So the tongue out position of Kali, for example, is tasting the forbidden. And when you actually get into the physicality, it's a really profound experience. It looks quite simple, but just the act of, and I think those who have worked in the course with me will perhaps reflect on it, but having that tongue out and moving in those positions of Kali already shifts your consciousness, your feelings around what is allowed, what is permitted. And they are absolutely wonderful spaces. I mean, they make this Maya reality really boring once you've been in those spaces. So the relationship with the archetype, one of the things that Hillman says in his work is we want to be careful that we don't think we're becoming archetypes, because he sort of says that's a little bit like a fantasy. But what we are doing is having a relationship with the archetypes. And the archetypal spaces may have other archetypes present in them as well. So, we can't suddenly think I've become Cleopatra or I've become Kali or whatever it is. But we have a relationship with those archetypal spaces. In India, you've got some traditions which actually ask you to become archetypes. And those traditions are very differently manifested because they're usually in lineages. People practice it and they belong to particular castes and communities who consider it usually their sacred duty to do these, to manifest as these or become these archetypes, and they live like that. They live those lives. So this particular image is one of the things that I absolutely unforgettable experiences of my childhood was watching what is called the Velichapada, or the oracle in the goddess temples in Kerala. And so this man, you see him coming into the temple. He's a very ordinary man. You wouldn't notice him in a crowd. So he comes into the temple, and then he puts on his red robe. He puts the bells around his waist. He lets his hair loose, and then he takes the scythe, and then he spends a long time in front of the Sanctum Sanctorum, in front of the goddess. And you could watch, so we were all allowed to stand, the people in the temple. You'd stand away and watch him changing, transforming. His body, starts to move in ways that you wouldn't think a normal human being can move. There was something sort of non-human, animal, human, and yet it wasn't wild or it was subtle, beautiful, and then the bells would start shaking, and then he would come out with this sort of this yell or this roar, which was again like something you'd never heard from a human being's mouth. And he would then dance up and down the outside of the temple. He would be pulling his hair with the scythe, and he'd be saying things in not at all in his own voice. And he would come and tell people things, and there were messages from the goddess. So I used to hide behind my dad, so I was terrified. And my poor dad never understood what he said anyway, so I'd ask him, what did he say? What did he say? And he'd make up something because he couldn't, it was difficult if you weren't really paying attention to get what he was saying. And then at the end of this, he would go back into the temple, and then you would see this, whatever it was, leaving him. And then he'd tie up his hair, take off his red cloth, and come out. You wouldn't notice him anymore. He would just be lost in a crowd. So these things which, and as you watched him, you would feel your body take on that, watching him. I remember putting my hand on my stomach and feeling my stomach trembling just watching him do this dancing. So there was something really in a communion that happens, and a bit like the rasa experience that happened in those performances. And there are several other traditions like this. In my own study with my teacher, he did demand that one became the archetype. So perhaps we could go to the next slide, Jeff. So when you come to Indian theatre, there is a demand also to become the archetypes in the archetypal theatre tradition. So I just want to clarify that not all Indian dance traditions are archetypal. Some of them, like the more sort of, there were temple dance traditions where you kind of narrated stories about archetypes. You went through a process of sublimation. But the more dance theatre traditions like Kathakali, which is a huge dance theatre tradition, and Kuchipudi, the tradition I studied, there was this idea that you became the archetype. And people specialized in particular archetypes. And you would go to a performance because you'd know so-and-so was performing and his Krishna is famous. He is, that's the specialty. So that there was that invitation to become the archetype. Can we go to the next slide, Jeff? So Kuchipudi, like I said, is a dance theatre tradition that embodies archetypes. Those pictures are of my teacher, one of the greatest dancers, the legendary Vempati Chinna Satyam. He is no more, and you can see him as those are positions of Shiva. Now, Vempati was actually known for his Shiva portrayal, even though Kuchipudi tradition was much more of a Krishna-based tradition in its more recent history, but Vempati's strength and his kind of, he resonated with the Shiva archetype. And every time he performed or he showed us the Shiva, it was Shiva. And he just became Shiva. So he always said that in interpreting the rasas or in interpreting what we call the abhinaya parts of Natya Shastra. Now, abhinaya, again, difficult word to translate, but it's been variously translated as acting or miming, which is far worse than acting. But Vempati was very clear that you do neither, you become. So for him, abhinaya was a process of becoming the archetype. And the way you did that was through a long period of apprenticeship, to being around him. He never really sat down and taught, but it's like you kind of breathed it in, when you were around him. There was a kind of a transmission process. You sort of, you watched him. He was Kuchipudi. So you watched him, you were around him, and you imbibed that in some way. You just imbibed that. So he really didn't like the idea of pretending to be something or acting as something. He always said, you need to become. And he would take a line and go on for 4 hours, 3 hours, saying, no, I don't feel it. I don't see Krishna. I don't see Krishna. And, so that until you just went through repeating, and you kind of, the depth. It was all about the depth. It wasn't about how many pieces did you have in your repertoire. If you had one piece, he just wanted you to be that piece, to be the archetype in that piece. Of course, this was getting more and more difficult even during his lifetime, this idea of wanting his students to become archetypes, because we didn't come. He was a dancer, a 10th generation dancer in his family. His family were part of the small group of families who lived in the Kuchipudi village, which is a village in Andhra Pradesh, and they were ordained to actually perform Kuchipudi in the local temple. Now, I went to the village in Kuchipudi years ago. Now it's a very famous place. It was a quiet, sleepy little village with one shop which sold colored ice creams. So when we lived there, that was our treat. We would go and have these colored ice creams. But now I'm told that it's quite thriving. That's sad. But that might be a nostalgia of a non-resident Indian, as people might say. These families lived in that village, and at the age of 18, Vempati left the village and came to Madras. because he wanted to take the dance out of the village. He wanted to do bigger things. He also told me that it's also because he didn't get the important roles in Kuchipudi, which are actually female roles. So men danced as women, and it was the female roles that were really important. So Satyabhama, who I will do shortly, just to show you the traditional archetypal mode, that was the big role in Kuchipudi, and he didn't get it because he was too tall for it. So he left the village, and then he kind of really developed Kuchipudi into one of the major classical forms. So I think I would be justified in saying perhaps the single biggest contribution to Kuchipudi was as it is today, was made by him. So he really gave it much more of a dance vocabulary. He also took it away from the archetypal traditions, and I'll come back to that, as to the inevitability of that happening a bit later on as well. So can we go to the next? I'm just going to show you a demonstration. I'm just going to check the time. Yeah. I'm just going to show you the demonstration of Satyabhama, who is one of the big and famous archetypal characters in Kuchipudi, one that everybody wanted to perform. So all the men who did Kuchipudi, their aim was that they wanted to do Satyabhama. She is one of the consorts of Krishna. She is fiery, proud, and in this piece, so what this is called a patra pravesha, which is actually a structure from Sanskrit theatre. So a patra pravesha is like a character introduction. So that's where these characters come and they introduce themselves, and they say, this is who I am. And so Satyabhama says, I'm the most beautiful person in all the 16 worlds. Even Krishna, the great Krishna, has fallen in love with me. So you can see that. So that's the mood of the piece. And she also says, my father is this wealthy king. And so she, that's the archetype of Satyabhama. And anyway, she learns how to become one with the Brahman. And for me, sadly, even when I was young, I thought that made her less interesting. I liked it when she was proud and fiery. But so I will show you a little section of Satyabhama. This is very traditional choreography. It's very old choreography by Siddhendra Yogi, who was one of the people who revived Kuchipudi, I think, if I'm not wrong, in about 14th century AD. So he actually revived by writing a lot of work for Kuchipudi. So a lot of this choreography has been handed down, and it's quite a traditional choreography. So here's Satyabhama.